going to begin to verbringen with this story. And I think it's a story that Rab Nisna Tibbet itself. I think that that's the source of the story. That the Frierdiker Rebbe was living in Russia. And he was being Misras Nefesh. I mean, he really was. The Frierdiker Rebbe was not planning how the situation in the Soviet Union was going to end. The Frierdiker Rebbe saw what he considered the Shas HaShmad, a time of Shmad. Shmad means where the attack on Yiddishkeit is not superficial. It's not an attack on something specific for a particular purpose, but it's an attack at the very heart, at the very soul, at the very essence of Yiddishkeit. And when you have such a situation, you need somebody to set a course of absolute Misras Nefesh, unreasonable readiness for Misras Nefesh. It's happened before in our history. You know, the story of Chanukah and the Chashmonoim is a classic example of people who realized that there was a circumstance that demanded Misras Nefesh, and they did it. Rabbi Akiva, right? The stories of the Gemara of Rabbi Akiva, where he was Misras Nefesh. The Frierdiker Rebbe saw the time in which he lived at such a moment, and he undertook to be Misras Nefesh, and he included in the Misras Nefesh his Talmidim, the Temimim, the Chassidim. But his attitude towards his situation was one of complete self-sacrifice. So this is a story that I heard, that a while before he was arrested Tezvot Sivan, he was arrested, this is the 95th anniversary of the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest and liberation. So he was arrested on the 15th of Sivan. They held him in prison for 18 and a half days until Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz, he was allowed, it was a Sunday. Gimel Tammuz, he was allowed to leave his incarceration, but he was forced into exile. The exile was supposed to be for 3 years. He was in exile for 9 days, or 10 days. On Yud Beis Tammuz, he was told unofficially, and Yud Gimel Tammuz, he was told officially that he's free to go. And the Frierdiker Rebbe went back home. And of course, the end of the story is that months later, for all kinds of reasons, the Rebbe had to leave Russia altogether. The Rebbe had to leave Russia. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was living a life of Misras Nefesh leading up to that. His whole life was a life of Misras Nefesh. This is the story that I heard. That he called in the Rebbe, our Rebbe. The Rebbe's Logazunzan, our Rebbe, who was a young man. The Rebbe was a relatively young man. The Rebbe was not yet married to Tafresh Peizayin. The Rebbe had just turned 25, approximately. And the Frierdiker Rebbe called in the Rebbe and he asked him shaylis, halacha questions. That if I'm going to be in a place, in a prison, he described what a prison is like. You share a room with other people, and there's a latrine. You understand how prisons are in Russia. There's a latrine, there's a toilet, and there's no separation, and there's no mechitzis, and there's no respect. So it becomes all kinds of halachic questions about how you daven and how you learn and how you do mitzvahs. So this is a story that I heard, that the Rebbe asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, how should he behave if he's in such a condition? And the Rebbe our Rebbe had to answer his questions on a level of halacha, tell him practically how each aspect of his situation should be addressed. And the Frierdiker Rebbe told him as follows, he says, Mir das nit negeya. I'm asking you questions in halacha. I want you to know that the questions I'm asking you are for me, not practical. Because I'm going to be Misras Nefesh for Kaisei Shel Yud, the Rebbe told him. The Frierdiker Rebbe said to the Rebbe, I am going to be uncompromising about anything at all, under all conditions. So he says, I'm asking the questions, even though practically I'm not going to do what you're paskening in halacha. So what's the point of asking the question if you're not going to listen? So the Rebbe said this expression, this is the Ma'aseh Gehet. The Frierdiker Rebbe said to the Rebbe, Ich will sehen wie a Chassidischer Rav tracht. That was the Rebbe's expression. I want to see how a Chassidischer Rav thinks, And I want to tell you a second story, which will qualify the first story. That in Tzaddik Gimel, in 1933 approximately, the Rav of Leningrad passed away. Leningrad had a Rav. Leningrad was a big city. And before the revolution, Leningrad was an Ir ve'emi Yisrael. There was a lot of Yiddishkeit and a lot of Torah and a lot of Chassidus. Leningrad had a Rav. The old Rav of Leningrad, his name was Katzenellenbogen. He was a Yeshish. He was an old man. He was a Rav for a very, very long time. And the Frierdiker Rebbe had a very interesting relationship with this Katzenellenbogen. At Geisna Misnagid. He was considered not a chassid. And this Rav Katzenellenbogen had certain tightness to the Frierdiker Rebbe. But the Frierdiker Rebbe had no tightness to him. In other words, he was an older man, and the Frierdiker Rebbe felt like he doesn't understand everything that's going on. So he had certain complaints to the Frierdiker Rebbe, but the Frierdiker Rebbe had no complaints to him. I'll tell you to what extent. I have a neighbor, his name is Hilke Zaltzman, Rav Hillel Zaltzman. He's old enough to be my father, so he's not exactly my friend. But he told me that his father was Rabbi Avram Zaltzman. And Rabbi Avram Zaltzman was a sheikhet. And he needed to take Kabbalah for Shechita. He needed to go to a Rav to get Kabbalah for Shechita. So this was when the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, was still living in Russia. So the previous Rebbe said to him, so we're going to go get Kabbalah. So he says, there's a Chassidish Rav in Leningrad, Rav Lazarov, Alzarov. I'll go to him, I'll get the Kabbalah for Shechita. So the Frierdiker says, what about Katzenellenbogen, the main rabbi in Leningrad, in Petersburg? So he tells the Rebbe, he's a misnagid. I don't want to get Kabbalah from him. So the Rebbe says of it as an Erlich Harid. He's a pious Jew, he's a righteous man. So Rabbi Avram Zaltzman says, but he's a misnagid, and he goes, I'm a chassid. He's going to test me very hard, and I'm going to fail the test. So the Rebbe told him, Vesta wissen. So you'll know. The Rebbe insisted that he should get Kabbalah from Rav Katzenellenbogen, and he went, and he gave him a very hard test, and he knew. He knew. He doesn't know how he knew, but he knew. But he was a very Erlich Yid. So when he passed away, when Katzenellenbogen passed away, they needed a successor, they needed a new Rav in Leningrad. So there was, even in those years, there was Baruch Hashem politics. The Chassidim put a candidate, and the Misnagdim put a candidate. Maybe there been a third candidate also. The candidate the Chassidim put was Lazarov, and the Misnagdim's candidate, I forget the name always, and I'm sorry, it's a name that I have to sort of remember. But a Yid, an Erlich Yid, a Misnagd, a Litvak, that when the Frierdiker Rebbe was living in Russia, he was one of the people that the Frierdiker Rebbe used to consult about Askonis at that time. So when there was a vacancy in the Rabbanans in Leningrad, the Chassidim wanted to have a Chassidish Rav, and the Misnagdim wanted a Misnagdish Rav. And there was a campaign. Campaigning. And then a message came from the Frierdiker Rebbe, who was not living in Russia anymore. And the message was that the Chassidim should vote for the Misnagdish candidate. So that the election was over. That was it. But everyone was very surprised. The Chassidim put up a Chassidish candidate, and the Misnagdim put up a Illumish candidate, and the previous Rebbe said that the Chassidim should vote for this man. The Rebbe knew him. And the Rebbe knew that he was a real Jew, and he's right to be the Rebbe of Leningrad. So the Chassidim decided that they have to find out who he is. Lithois al Kankanai. Who is this man who's from the other team, and the Rebbe wants Dafke him. The Frierdiker Rebbe wanted he should be Rav. So they sent Reb Chaikel Chanan Alav Shalom, who was a Bacher, an elder Bacher, and he was a businessman, to his home. And his role was he should knock on the door, and he should say that he's passing through Leningrad doing business, needs a place to stay. Would it be okay if he stays with the Rav? He should host him as an oirech, as a guest. So the Rav was very happy to invite him in, and he stayed in his home. A couple of days after he arrives, there's a knock on the door, and an elderly Jew, an elderly Jew comes into his house. He's very upset. He's crying. He's very upset. And he says to the Rav, he says, Rebbe, I have been through my whole life. I was never Machal Shabbos. I was always Echel Kosher. I behaved as I'm supposed to behave. I raised Yiddish kinder. And now they're telling me that I don't work Shabbos. They're going to throw me out of my apartment. I'm going to live on the street. When Nechalum Kuben, I'm going to expire. And I'm not going to have panos, I'm not going to feed my family. What am I supposed to do? They're forcing me to work Shabbos. So this Rav sat down with this Yid. This is the Soviet Union, 1933, something like that. And he went through all of the shaylas, every question that he had about how he went to work and what his work was, and he explained to him the difference between a Deiraisa and a Derabonon. And he talked this Yid through. He said, listen, you should go to work. Don't do this, but do this. He helped him understand that it was possible for him to be frum, to be Shemesh Shabbos, and he should be able to show up at work. He says he's not going to be Machal Shabbos. He helped him deal with the technicalities of Shabbos, they should be able to keep his life and keep Shabbos. And it was very beautiful, very sensitive, it was very kind. The next day, a Lubavitcher Chassid comes in, a Tamim, with the same exact shaila. There was a difference, however. The difference was, he was a Talmid Chacham, and he knew all the Hetedim, and he had already worked them out. He had them all worked out already. So he came into the Rav not to ask him what to do, but to present him with all the Hetedim he had come up with, and to get approval that the Rav should agree that this is a legitimate way he could be able to keep Shabbos, and he shouldn't lose his apartment. I mean, this is real stuff. You and I sit here in Miami Beach and tell such stories. We don't really relate to the reality of Pekuach Nefesh. And that's what this was. This was Mamish Pekuach Nefesh. So he comes into the Sebrav the next day, and he explains to him, listen, this is my job. And if I lose my job, I lose my apartment. If I lose my apartment, I'm not going to have what to eat, and so on and so forth, and have children and the whole thing. And I think this is how I could work it out, that I should not be Machal Shabbos. And he presents the Rav with his thoughts. And when he finishes, this Rav, and I really wish I remembered his name, says, absolutely not. Shum Meifin. For me, you're not getting a heter for Koitza Shayud. For me, I'm not going to allow you to make any compromises at all. You're a Talmid Chacham, you're a learned man, you seem to have worked it out. He said, but if you're asking me that I should allow you to make these kind of compromises, for me, I'm giving you no heter. And he was very emphatic, very resolute, and very strong. I'm not going to help you do things less than optimally, than the highest level. So this Yid left. So after he left, so Reb Chaikel Chanan, who witnessed this, says to this Rav, last night somebody came in, and he asked you the same question, and you talked him through these Hetedim exactly. Today, somebody else comes in with the same exact situation. They say, B'shom Eifim, I'm not helping you. I'm not going to help you find a way out of your dilemma. He says, why? So he says to him like this, a Yid lives in Russia, he's struggling, he wants to be an Elach Yid, it's my job to help him. Then he used an expression in Russian. But it's not I sat Shabbos in a shul, and a Russian guy told me it means something altogether different. But whatever, Kodetsky Korpus, I don't know what those words mean. He said to him, the royal guard. The royal guard, the personal guard of the king. There's no compromises. In other words, he said to this is a Lubavitcher Chassid, he said. A Lubavitcher Chassid is a Tamim. He's a soldier. He says, for them there's no compromises. This was the story. So this was what the Chassidim were trying to find out. What did the Frierdiker Rebbe see in this Rav, this so-called Misnagdish Rav, that he preferred him over a Chassidish Rav? And the insight, Rabbi side, what's behind this is that we don't know what Misras Nefesh is. We really don't. We don't know what Misras Nefesh is. We live in America. We have a Misras Nefesh, right? Our Misras Nefesh, we'll talk about it later, but the Misras Nefesh that Yidden in Russia had, we don't understand what it means. We can't begin to understand what that life is like. And when you're in a circumstance of Misras Nefesh, a Rav doesn't only paskin from the book, from the Sefer, from the book. A Rav paskins from his neshama. Because there are Piskei Din that are not based on the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't address these kinds of questions. Shulchan Aruch does not have workable solutions. And the quality of a Rav under those circumstances is defined not only by how much he can learn, but how in touch he is with that other dimension. And the Frierdiker Rebbe felt that this Yid appreciates this. And that's why the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted people to vote for him. But this is the story. This is the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So of Yidden in Russia, Lubavitch in Russia, Anash in Russia, Temimim in Russia. That there was a circumstance of Misras Nefesh. And Misras Nefesh means that you're figuring out how to be a Jew based on your soul, on your conscience, on your inner self. And that's very, how do I say this? You can be frum. If you know the Shulchan Aruch, you can learn the laws and you can follow the laws. But when there's no laws, And the law has to come from a person's neshama. They have to be in touch with that neshama. And the Frierdiker Rebbe obviously was that person. And the Frierdiker Rebbe called that out of Chassidim, of Anash, of Temimim. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe was released from prison, he made a Yom Tov. He made a Yom Tov because his victory, as he himself wrote in a letter, was not personal. He was released from prison. This is my feeling. This may be a statement that you're not allowed to say, but this is my feeling. When the Frierdiker Rebbe walked out of the Shpalerka prison alive, he was the most surprised man. The Rebbe Rayatz, the Frierdiker Rebbe, did absolutely nothing to save himself. Nothing. The Frierdiker Rebbe did nothing to help himself. The Frierdiker Rebbe went to Misras Nefesh. He had one direction. He had no idea how it was going to end. One direction. The Eibishter saved him. The Eibishter saved him. The Frierdiker Rebbe did nothing to save himself. Hashem saved his life. And because the previous Rebbe saw that the Eibishter saved his life, he understood that this was an act of God to indicate, to say, to reveal, to show that ultimately there's going to be the Dam Notzach, that Yiddishkeit is going to win, and that Chassidus is going to win, and the Eibishter is going to win. And that's why your Beis Tammuz is a Yom Tov. So let's say L'chaim, I need a little bit of from the Sefaran. L'chaim v'levracha, we live in a different world. No, it's fine. We live in a different world. We live in a very, very different world. But we celebrated Beis Gimel Tammuz. For Sefaran HaMais, I'll tell you a story. That it's a lyhadus Sichos. Dr. Zellickson got married Chanukah Tafshin Yud Beis. Dr. Zellickson was the Rebbe's doctor. He was a Kodev. He was related to the Rebbe, and he had a very special relationship with the Rebbe. When I was a child, my parents didn't use Dr. Zellickson. My mother was too American for Dr. Zellickson. I didn't know who Dr. Zellickson was. But in 770 there was a Yid who stood a whole day in davened. A whole day in davened. He would stand downstairs and daven. When we were children, the doors of 770 were always open. I need to tell you this. For those of you who are not old enough, when I was a child, no door in 770 was locked. The only door in 770 that was locked was the Rebbe's room. We used to play in the hallway outside the Rebbe's room. We used to run upstairs to the second floor. We used to make ourselves crazy in the elevators. 770 was our home. Later they had to lock up doors because they couldn't keep them unlocked. But when I was a child, and even when I was after Bar Mitzvah, 770 wasn't locked. So I would open up the door to Gan Eden HaTachten, that means the room right outside the Rebbe's room, and there was this Yid with his glasses at the tip of his nose, a whole day in Talsum film davening. I thought he was a tzaddik nisner. That was Dr. Zellickson. They would come to 770 in the middle of davening. He would gedam bariches jeden tag. As a child, I mamish thought he was a tzaddik when I discovered that he was Dr. Zellickson. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, but when Dr. Zellickson got married, the Rebbe was Masad Kedushin. The Rebbe officiated at his wedding. And the Rebbe actually went to the hall. In the mamish early years, the Rebbe did not only do the Siddur Kedushin, he actually went to the hall. I don't know where it was, whether it was Brooklyn or it was Manhattan. And the Rebbe spoke 2 long sichos. And when Dr. Zellickson passed away, his son, Machon, had seichel. He wrote up the sichos, and he sent them into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe edited the sichos, and he published them in his father's biography. He made a biography of his father, and now it's printed in lyhadus Sichos. So the Rebbe spoke about it was Chanukah, Tafshin Yud Beis. He spoke about Misras Nefesh. So at the chuppah, at the chasana, there were rabbonim who were not Lubavitchers. Dr. Zellickson's wife came from a family of Germanic Jews, Yekeshe. And she had, I don't know what kind of family she had, but 2 rabbonim were sitting at the head table, non-Lubavitchers, Litvische rabbonim, Yekeshe rabbonim, Germanic rabbonim, and the Rebbe talked, and they listened, but they were people, and they made some comments, and the comments are printed in the Sicha. And one of the comments that one of these rabbonim said to the Rebbe is, why is the Frierdiker Rebbe talking so much about Misras Nefesh? Now, I wasn't there. I wasn't even born. But I could understand the question. It was 6 years after the Holocaust. Now you have to talk about Misras Nefesh. You can't find a better topic. So one of these Rabbonim asked the Rebbe, why is the Lubavitcher Rebbe talking about Misras Nefesh? So the Rebbe answered him very vaguely. The Rebbe said, the Rebbe Deshvel gesagt, as in America, darf man reden wegen Misras Nefesh. That was the Rebbe's answer, if I remember correctly. Which means the Rebbe Deshvel, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, in America you have to talk about Misras Nefesh. That's all the Rebbe said. Sosim v'loy pirish. But the truth is, it says in Tanya. In the end of Tanya, chapter 25, Perek Chav Hey, which is the Perek about Misras Nefesh, the Alter Rebbe writes that the mitzvah of Shema Yisrael, was given l'dersh nichnasul aretz. The mitzvah every day, you say Shema Yisrael, was given to the Yidden who are going into Eretz Yisrael. So the Alter Rebbe asked this question. Shema Yisrael is Misras Nefesh. Shema Yisrael is connected to Misras Nefesh. The Yidden going into Eretz Yisrael, we're not facing Misras Nefesh. The pasuk is Pachtachem, Umerachem, Yit and Avaya. Yidden are going to go into Eretz Yisrael and they're going to be powerful and independent and sovereign and strong and wealthy. So the Alter Rebbe asks, why is Moshe giving the mitzvah of Misras Nefesh to a generation of Jews who are not going to know Misras Nefesh? That was the Alter Rebbe's question. Alter Rebbe gave a profound answer. A generation of Jews that has Misras Nefesh doesn't have to talk about it. They live it. A generation of Jews that doesn't have Misras Nefesh, that their life is good, they have to talk about Misras Nefesh. Why do you have to talk about Misras Nefesh? And Misras Nefesh is not realistic, because talking about Misras Nefesh affects the way we keep Torah mitzvahs under all conditions. It's one of the most important messages in the Tanya, that a person could use Misras Nefesh as a motivator for every day. So we sit here in America, we talk about what happened in a different time, in a very different time, in a very different place, and I suppose we could say, we thank God that we live in the country in which we live, but the Eibusha doesn't change, and Torah doesn't change, and Yiddishkeit doesn't change, and the motivation that we need to be Yidden and Chassidim is still real. And talking about Misras Nefesh helps. L'chaim. L'chaim. L'chaim.